I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who walks into a building looking for a job and walks out with the first threat of a crime. But that's exactly what happened. And I'm still not entirely sure whether to call it the worst day of my life or the day my life actually started. Let me tell you something shocking. The truth about my marriage didn't come from a confrontation, a confession, or a private investigator. It came from an HR representative with a frozen expression and 6 words I will never forget as long as I live. 6 words that cracked 8 years of carefully constructed lies open like they were made of paper. I couldn't believe it when she said them. I almost asked her to repeat herself. And then I realized she already had, in 100 small ways I had been too trusting to see. Here is the paradox no one talks about. The most dangerous lies aren't the dramatic ones. They're not the ones delivered in tears or with shaking hands. They're the quiet ones, the structural ones, the ones built into the architecture of your daily life until you can't tell what's real and what's been curated for your consumption. I was cheated on, yes. But that's almost too simple a word for what happened. I was rewritten. I was edited out of my own story and replaced with a version of myself that was convenient, controllable, and, critically, would never come looking. He lied to me about who he was. He lied to her about who he was. And he lied to an entire company. Right up until the morning a woman walked through their front doors and said her own name out loud. What happened next is the kind of story that sounds impossible until you remember that impossible things happen inside ordinary marriages every day, behind closed doors and shared calendars, and I love you texts sent from the same phone used to manage a double life. There was infidelity, yes. There was betrayal. The bone-deep kind, the kind that makes you question not just the person, but your own perception of reality. But there was also fraud. Corporate fraud. Nearly $2 million worth. Exposed eventually, in a dossier that landed in board members' personal inboxes on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m. And by the time it was over, the man who had built an empire on other people's trust had lost everything, while the woman he'd assumed would never look became the one running his company. My name is Ruby Reyes. But after I married Ryan Park, the world started calling me Ruby Park. And that's why what she said next hit like a car crash. This is the story of how I applied to my husband's company, discovered he had a second wife, uncovered a financial scandal hiding in plain sight, and rebuilt my entire life. Not in spite of what happened, but because of exactly what I chose to do with it. This is not a story about a woman falling apart. This is a story about a woman who was humiliated, shamed, and backstabbed in the most spectacular way imaginable, and who responded, not with a breakdown, but with a dossier. If you've ever been lied to by someone you loved and wondered whether the truth would ever catch up with them, stay with me. Because this time, it did. I never thought I'd be the woman sitting in a stranger's conference room, hands trembling, staring at an HR rep who looked like she'd seen a ghost. I was just there for a job interview, a senior marketing role at a company I knew the story of from the outside, the myth Ryan had sold the world. But the moment I slid my resume across the table, the woman froze, her eyes flickering between me and her screen like she was solving an impossible equation. She cleared her throat twice before she spoke, and when she finally did, the words landed like a slap I didn't see coming. "I'm sorry," she said slowly, "but Mrs. Park already works here." I felt my whole body go still, the kind of still that happens when your brain refuses to process what your ears just heard. Mrs. Park, Ruby Park, the name I'd taken 8 years ago when I married Ryan and believed, truly believed, it meant something. I almost laughed, because what else do you do when reality cracks open right in front of you and something grotesque is staring back? I couldn't believe it. I sat there blinking, while the HR rep looked at me with this careful, polite terror, clearly unsure whether I was about to cry or flip the table. Here's the thing nobody tells you about betrayal. It doesn't always announce itself with a dramatic scene or a screaming fight. Sometimes it walks in quietly, wearing business casual, and introduces itself through a receptionist who's just doing her job. I had dressed nicely that morning. I had prepared my portfolio. I had rehearsed my elevator pitch in the car on the way over, excited about the idea of reclaiming my professional identity after years of putting it on pause. And in 30 seconds flat, my life turned into something I didn't recognize. The truth hit differently when there was a stranger in the room to witness it. The HR rep, her name tag said Priya, excused herself with a kind of practiced calm that told me this wasn't a normal Tuesday for her either. She disappeared through a glass door, leaving me alone in a room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago and a branded Nexus Analytics coffee mug that I suddenly wanted to throw through the glass. Humiliated doesn't even cover what I was feeling. It was that specific, particular shame of being the last person in a room to understand a joke that everyone else has been in on for years. Shamed by a situation I hadn't even created, sitting in a building my husband helped build. I pulled out my phone, not to call Ryan, not yet, but because my hands needed something to do, some motion to disguise the fact that my whole world had just tilted sideways. I opened LinkedIn. I typed in 2 words, Sophia Park, and there she was. Polished profile photo, confident smile, head of operations at Nexus Analytics, 3 years at the company, connection count in the thousands, endorsements and recommendations stacking up like trophies. 3 years. While I'd been at home, supporting Ryan's vision, attending his company dinners and nodding along to stories about a company I knew by reputation but never from the inside. I stared at that screen until the words blurred. And just when I thought the shock had reached its ceiling, my eyes drifted to her profile photo. And I saw it. Right there on her wrist. A Tiffany bracelet. Sterling silver, twisted rope design, the kind of piece that costs more than most people's rent. I knew that bracelet. I knew it because Ryan had come home from a business trip to New York 6 months ago, with a slightly guilty energy I'd written off as work stress. And now, sitting in his company's conference room, the pieces were snapping together with a sound that was almost audible. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the 8 years that came before it. 8 years. I want you to really sit with that number, because it's not just time. It's choices, compromises, entire versions of yourself you quietly set aside for somebody else's dream. I was 31 when I met Ryan Park at a startup networking event in Chicago, back when I had a career I was genuinely proud of. A rising role in brand strategy at a mid-size agency, a portfolio I'd built from scratch, and a 5-year plan that had my name on it. He was brilliant and electric and completely convinced that he was going to change the tech industry. And I believed him, because the way he talked about the future made you want to climb inside it. We got married fast, faster than my mother thought was wise, and she said so twice over Sunday lunch, which I promptly ignored. What I didn't ignore was the moment Ryan sat me down, 18 months into our marriage, and told me that Nexus Analytics was at a crossroads. He needed stability at home. He needed an anchor, was the word he used, like I was something that kept a ship from drifting. And I, who had grown up watching my parents trade off sacrifices like gifts, said yes. I stepped back from my position. I became the person who managed the household, the social calendar, the emotional infrastructure of our life. I told myself it was temporary. Family drama was something that happened to other people. 5 years. That's how long I stayed in that temporary arrangement. 5 years of attending Nexus events as Ryan's wife, not as a professional in my own right. 5 years of explaining to old colleagues that I was taking a break. 5 years of internalizing the very quiet, very insidious message that my ambitions were secondary, that my self-worth was tied to how well I supported someone else's ascent. The gaslighting hadn't started yet, at least not in any form I would have named at the time. It was softer than that. It was Ryan saying things like, "You wouldn't understand the corporate dynamics," or, "You've been out of the loop for a while, babe." Small cuts, invisible paper wounds. And the most shocking part? I was good at it. I was genuinely good at being the person behind the person. I organized his press appearances, advised on brand tone, made the kind of sharp observations at dinner parties that made his colleagues lean in. And then I'd watch Ryan take that energy into the room the next morning and turn it into success, while I went back to managing contractors for a kitchen renovation. I had cheated myself, slowly, daily, and called it love, called it partnership, called it karma paying forward for a future that was just around the corner, always just around the corner. I believed the narrative because it was the only one I had. Then, one afternoon last spring, I was sitting with my journal, something my therapist had suggested as a way to reconnect with personal goals. And I wrote a single sentence that I couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. What do I actually want to do next? Not, what does Ryan need? Not, what makes sense for the household? Just, me. And the answer came so fast it startled me. I wanted back in. I wanted a real role, a real challenge, a real identity outside of Ryan Park's wife. So I started quietly updating my portfolio. I reached out to a few contacts. And then I saw the listing for a senior marketing director at Nexus Analytics. I knew the brand. I knew the founder story. I'd lived inside it for years. What I didn't know was the company Ryan had built behind my back. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that walking through those front doors would be less like a job interview and more like a detonation. A slow-motion, beautifully terrible detonation that would expose every lie I'd been living inside. And I couldn't believe it then, but I would later. Set me free. But first, I had to understand the full architecture of the betrayal. And that started with a CFO who had been keeping secrets of his own. The conference room felt smaller when Priya left, or maybe I just felt larger, too full of something sharp and electric to sit comfortably in a standard-issue chair surrounded by motivational posters and branded notepads. I kept staring at Sophia Park's LinkedIn profile, scrolling slowly, methodically, the way you examine something dangerous to make sure it's real. Head of Operations. Joined Nexus 3 years ago. Prior experience, 2 roles in consulting, a master's from Northwestern. She was accomplished. She was polished. And she had been given my married name, the name I had chosen to carry, the name I had built a life around. Family betrayal doesn't always look like a villain. Sometimes it looks exactly like this, competent, well-lit, and smiling. The bracelet was the piece that broke me open. I know that sounds strange, that after everything it was jewelry that did it. But there's something about a physical object that makes denial impossible. Abstract betrayal can be argued with. You can tell yourself stories, rationalize timelines, invent innocent explanations. But a $9,000 Tiffany bracelet, sterling silver, twisted rope design, the exact one I had seen in a thanks for your patience while I travel gift bag from Ryan 6 months ago, doesn't lie. He had brought home a matching one for me. He had kissed me on the cheek and said he'd picked it up in New York. And all this time, the woman he gave the original to had been running his company 3 floors above where I was currently being told I didn't exist. I was lied to with jewelry. You can't make this up. I opened Ryan's Instagram. Something I rarely did because he was private about social media, he always said, which I had taken as a personality trait and not, apparently, a security protocol. I searched carefully. There were photos of company events, product launches, the occasional staged candid of Ryan at a conference. And then, in a post from 14 months ago that I must have scrolled past 100 times, a blurred group photo at what looked like a holiday party. In the background, a woman with a silver bracelet catching the light, laughing at something just off camera. I zoomed in until the image pixelated. I could feel the karma shifting in the room. I couldn't believe I had been this blind. Or maybe I could, because I'd been trained to look away. What happened next was almost clinical. Something inside me went very quiet and very focused, like a camera lens rotating slowly until a blurry image sharpens. I wasn't going to cry. Not here, not in this conference room, not in front of whatever was about to come through that glass door. I was going to think. I was going to be smart. I had spent 5 years training myself to absorb information on behalf of someone else's career, and now I was going to use every single one of those skills on my own behalf. I pulled out a notebook, old habit from my agency days, and I started writing down everything I'd seen. Dates, names, the bracelet, the LinkedIn tenure, the fact that an entire HR department operated under the assumption that Sophia Park was Ryan's wife. The door opened. Priya came back, and she wasn't alone. Behind her was a man in his early 50s, well-dressed, carrying the specific tension of someone who has rehearsed what he's about to say and still isn't sure it's going to land. He introduced himself as David Chen, CFO. He sat across from me, folded his hands on the table, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between professional caution and something that looked, unexpectedly, like relief. Like someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. He started talking carefully, measuring every word, and the more he spoke, the more I understood that I hadn't just walked into a job interview. I had walked into the edge of something much larger, much darker, something that had been quietly unraveling inside Nexus Analytics for years. And David Chen, it turned out, had been watching it happen. David Chen didn't waste time on pleasantries, and honestly, I respected him for it. He told me calmly and directly that I wasn't the first anomaly he'd noticed, but I was the one that made the pattern undeniable. The company, he said, treated Sophia Park as Ryan's spouse, not through official paperwork, but through something worse: informal power. Access, travel approvals, expense codes, board event invitations, executive introductions. It was a social and corporate status, constructed over 3 years that Ryan had never corrected. Not once. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a constructed reality. An alternate life, built inside a corporation, funded by a company I had helped nurture from the sidelines. I've been quietly flagging irregularities for about 8 months, David told me, his voice low, measured. He explained that certain expense lines hadn't made sense to him, travel charges that didn't correspond to any company trips, vendor payments that looped back to entities he couldn't fully trace. A budget line item that had been reclassified so many times it had essentially become invisible. He'd flagged it internally once and had been told by Ryan directly that it related to strategic partnerships under NDA. David had noted the answer, but hadn't accepted it. He was the kind of man who kept receipts, literally. He slid a thin folder across the table toward me and said simply, "I think you should see this." I felt the weight of that folder before I even opened it. The truth has a specific gravity. Inside were 3 pages of summarized transactions, dates, amounts, descriptions that had been painstakingly decoded from company accounting software. What I saw made my chest tighten with a specific, nauseating clarity. There was a lease payment, recurring monthly, to an LLC I didn't recognize. There were charges coded as executive hospitality that traced back to a luxury condo in River North. There were first-class flights, 2 passengers never named, coded as executive travel. There were designer purchases run through a vendor account tied to client gifting. And over 3 years, when David had added it all up, the number he arrived at was staggering. Close to $2 million quietly siphoned from Nexus Analytics' budget to fund a second life that Ryan had been living while I ironed his shirts at home and called it partnership. Family betrayal on a corporate scale. I had been backstabbed in the most elaborate way imaginable. I want to describe what it feels like to sit across from a near stranger and look at financial evidence that your marriage is not what you thought it was, that your husband is not who you thought he was, and that the sacrifice of 5 years of your professional life helped, indirectly, subsidize someone else's happiness. It doesn't feel like anger. Not immediately. It feels like the floor is made of paper and you've only just noticed. It feels like every memory you have is now suspect. Every "I'm working late," every I have a bored dinner, every apology bouquet and guilt-driven gift. Humiliated is too small a word. I had been used as a prop in a story I wasn't allowed to read. David said something then that I've thought about many times since. Ryan is very good at making people feel like the problem is their perception, not his behavior. I nodded slowly. He didn't know the half of it. He had watched it from a conference room. I had lived it in my own home, in my own bed, in my own sense of self. But hearing it from someone else, from a professional, a witness, a person with documents, did something important. It made the betrayal real in a way that couldn't be argued away. It made me understand that this wasn't about me being naive or overly trusting. This was strategic. This was engineered. And it had been going on for a very long time. David closed the folder carefully and looked at me. "What do you want to do?" he asked. And in that moment, something shifted in me. Something cold and clear and completely resolved. I didn't answer him right away. I didn't have to. But I was already thinking about next steps, about lawyers, about evidence, about the very specific and methodical kind of justice that doesn't make noise until it's too late to stop it. What I didn't know yet was just how deep the gaslighting went, or how thoroughly Ryan had rewritten reality for everyone around him. Numbers don't lie. That's the thing about financial evidence that makes it so devastating. It doesn't have feelings. It doesn't soften the blow. It doesn't leave room for, maybe you're misunderstanding. Every transaction David had flagged sat on those pages with the kind of cold, impassive honesty that people never manage in person. And the picture they painted together was a masterclass in compartmentalization and fraud. The LLC, registered in Delaware, named something generic like Meridian Holdings Group, held a lease on a fully furnished luxury condo in Chicago's River North neighborhood. 2 bedrooms, rooftop access, building with a concierge. I looked it up on my phone while David watched. The listing photos were still live. It looked like a home. A real, lived-in home. Not a rental. A life. The travel records were almost elegant in how they were hidden. Ryan had a legitimate pattern of quarterly trips for investor meetings and industry conferences. Real trips, real meetings. I had seen the schedules. And nested inside those trips were extensions, additions, itinerary detours that appeared on the company card as vague line items. A site visit to New York that had 2 business-class tickets on it. A team off-site in Miami that included charges at a hotel spa and a private dinner for 2. The word team was doing a lot of heavy lifting on those expense reports. And because Ryan was the CEO, the final authority on almost every internal approval, no one had questioned him. Or if they had, they hadn't pressed. When you're the one who signs the checks, people tend to look the other way. I had been cheated on a credit card statement. The designer purchases were the part that made me laugh. Actually laugh, the kind that doesn't have any humor in it. There was a vendor account in the system registered under a name I didn't recognize, coded under Client Relations and Gifting. It had been used over 27 months for purchases at Tiffany, at Nordstrom, at a boutique hotel spa, at florists. The totals weren't enormous by corporate standards, a few thousand here, a few thousand there, but they were consistent, patterned, and clearly personal. Someone was being gifted, regularly, thoughtfully, on the company's dime. And I had received exactly 2 things from that vendor account, it turned out. A bracelet and a handbag, both during periods I could now map to moments when Ryan's guilt must have peaked. I had been kept quiet with stolen money. What broke something loose in my chest was the timeline. David had traced the earliest suspicious transaction back 37 months. I did the math automatically, the way you do when you're trying to locate a wound. 37 months ago, Ryan and I had just had a long weekend away to celebrate our 5th wedding anniversary. He'd been warm, attentive, present in a way that had felt almost surprising, and now I understood why. He was managing me. He was recalibrating my sense of normal while simultaneously funding a completely different life on the other side of the city. The infidelity wasn't even the most insulting part anymore. The most insulting part was the precision, the planning. The fact that I had been a variable in someone's risk management strategy. Almost $2 million. Over 3 years. I kept returning to that number. Not because money was the point. It never really is, not in stories like this, but because it represented something beyond financial fraud. It represented time, choices. A version of my life that was built on a false foundation, funded by a lie, and maintained by a man who had quietly decided that I was manageable enough to deceive indefinitely. Ryan had looked at me, at our marriage, at my sacrifices, at my quietly shelved ambitions, and calculated that I would never look too closely. That was the real payback I owed myself, to prove that calculation spectacularly, completely wrong. But before I could act, I needed to understand exactly how he'd kept it all from falling apart. She's very private, social anxiety. She wouldn't be comfortable at events. That was what Ryan had told his colleagues about me. David had heard it himself, more than once, at company gatherings where my absence needed explaining. He recounted it almost apologetically, like he was handing me something he knew would sting. And it did sting, but not in the way you might expect. It stung with recognition, because I remembered the exact moments those words would have been crafted. The company holiday party 3 years ago, where Ryan said I wasn't feeling well. The investor dinner where I had genuinely wanted to come, and Ryan had gently suggested I'd find it overwhelming. The conference in Austin where I'd been invited as a spouse and then quietly uninvited because the dynamic had changed. I had accepted all of it. I'd trusted his read of my own comfort levels more than my own. That is what gaslighting does at its most sophisticated. It doesn't make you question reality directly. It positions itself as care. I'm protecting you. I know how you are in those situations. You always feel anxious in big crowds, remember? It borrows the language of intimacy to build a cage. Ryan had systematically painted a picture of me, to his colleagues, to his board, to his other life, as someone fragile, private, unlikely to appear unannounced. He was managing risk. He was building a firewall using my own supposed vulnerabilities as the material. And the cruelest part was that I had handed him those vulnerabilities myself, in moments of genuine trust, in late-night conversations where I'd shared my insecurities with the person I thought was safest. He had taken notes. On the other side of the equation, David told me what Ryan had told Sophia. I sat very still for that part. He'd told her he was divorced. Not separated, divorced. Clean break, years ago, no drama. He'd described a marriage that had ended amicably, a woman he wished well, a chapter that was firmly closed. Sophia had believed him because why wouldn't she? He was charming, credible, accomplished. She had no reason to Google Ryan Park married because he was her CFO verified, office acknowledged, board event attending partner, treated socially as his wife in every room that mattered. He had built 2 complete narratives and distributed them to 2 different audiences, and he had done it so cleanly that neither woman had any reason to look for the seams. The lie wasn't sloppy. The lie was architectural. I thought about all the times I'd felt vaguely unsettled and talked myself out of it. The business trip to New York, the late nights at the office that I'd never questioned because Ryan always had a logical explanation, and I had always chosen to believe him over my own instincts. That's the deepest damage gaslighting does. It doesn't just make you doubt the facts. It makes you distrust your own perception as a data source. I had been shamed into small-mindedness. I had been taught to read my own suspicions as evidence of my insecurity rather than evidence of his dishonesty. And I had called it being a supportive partner. I had called it dignity. I had called it grace. But here's what Ryan miscalculated. What all people who gaslight eventually miscalculate. They assume the architecture is permanent. They assume that because it's worked for years, it will keep working. They mistake endurance for acceptance and patience for powerlessness. The dignity I had quietly maintained throughout this marriage, the self-worth I had kept alive under the surface even when I'd buried it professionally, that wasn't gone. It was waiting. And now, sitting across from a CFO with a folder full of evidence, having been lied to in ways that were now documented, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. Not anger. Not devastation. Clarity. The kind that arrives after the storm passes and the air is suddenly, completely still. What I did next? I didn't do in a rush. I didn't call Ryan screaming. I didn't post anything. I didn't make a single move that could be used against me. Because I had spent 5 years learning how this man operated, and I was going to use every single thing I knew. There was someone I needed to call first. Someone who had been in my corner long before Ryan Park ever existed. And she was going to help me build something he would never see coming. Margaret Torres picked up on the second ring, the way she always did when she sensed something was urgent without being told. She had been my mentor since my agency days. The woman who'd first hired me out of grad school, who'd told me I had a strategic mind wrapped in emotional intelligence, who'd watched me step back from my career with the quiet concern of someone who knows a mistake when they see one, but understands you have to make it yourself. I hadn't called her in months. Honestly, I was embarrassed by how much time had passed, but the moment she heard my voice, she didn't comment on the gap. She just said, "Tell me everything." I did. And when I finished, there was a pause, and then, "How do you want to play this?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm so sorry." She knew me. She went straight to the move. Here is what I knew. Sitting in my car in the Nexus Analytics parking garage with the engine off and Margaret's voice in my ear. I was not going to do this emotionally. I was not going to let Ryan's narrative, the one where I was fragile and impulsive and privately anxious, be confirmed by a public scene. Because that's what he would have wanted, I realized. A chaotic confrontation would benefit him. It would let him position me as unstable, as vengeful, as a woman having a breakdown. And the vengeance I was after wasn't the kind you get from a screaming match. It was the kind that requires documentation, strategy, and time. Justice, real justice, the kind that holds, doesn't make noise until the moment it's designed to. I had just decided I was going to design every moment of what came next. Margaret connected me with Rachel Morrison within 48 hours. Rachel was a family and corporate law attorney based in Chicago, known specifically for cases involving financial dissipation in high-asset divorces, which, as she explained to me on our first call, is exactly what Ryan had been doing. Dissipation of marital assets, the legal term for using shared money to fund an affair, a second life, or any personal activity that the betrayed spouse was excluded from. Rachel's voice was calm and exact in the way that good lawyers' voices always are. Not cold, just load-bearing. She said the combination of documented corporate fraud and marital dissipation was unusually strong, and that we needed to be careful, strategic, and above all, quiet. "Don't change your behavior at home," she told me. "Don't tip your hand." So I went home that evening and made dinner. The other move Margaret helped me make was professional. She called in a favor, the kind built on years of mutual respect in the industry, and within a week, I had a conversation with a marketing consultancy that was quietly searching for a vice president of brand strategy. It wasn't a dramatic leap. It was a careful, targeted placement, calibrated to give me financial independence without making noise. I accepted the role, arranged for a modest but livable salary to begin hitting a personal account Ryan didn't have access to, and started quietly building the runway I would need to step off the ledge of this marriage without free-falling. Reclaiming my career wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. You cannot fight a war from a position of complete financial dependence. I had learned that lesson late, but I had learned it. What surprised me most during those 10 days after the conference room, the 10 days before I made any overt move, was how calm I felt. Not numb, not dissociated, but genuinely, functionally calm. The kind of calm that arrives when you have a plan and the plan is good. I slept. I exercised. I responded to Ryan's texts with the exact warmth I'd always shown him, because nothing had happened yet and the performance needed to hold. That is the thing about long game strategy. It requires you to be two people for a little while. The version of me that made coffee and asked about Ryan's day, and the version of me that was meeting with attorneys and building a career and cataloging every lie with quiet, methodical fury. The second version was the real one. There was one moment, though, just one, where I almost broke. Ryan came home on a Wednesday night with flowers. Not a special occasion, just flowers, the way he sometimes did when his guilt quietly surfaced and needed somewhere to go. He handed them to me with a smile and said, "Just because." And I looked at him, really looked at him, and thought, "You have no idea what's already in motion." I smiled back. I put the flowers in water. And I went to bed thinking about my next dinner with Rachel and what documents she needed next. The trap was already set. Now I just needed to watch him walk into it. It was a Thursday evening when I decided to test the edges of the lie. Not dramatically, not yet, but surgically. I made his favorite dinner, sea bass with roasted fennel, the kind of meal that signals warmth and domesticity, and says, "Everything is fine," in the language of food. I set the table properly, lit a candle, opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving for no particular occasion. Ryan came home and visibly relaxed the moment he walked in, and I made a mental note of that, because it told me something important. He was running a tension level higher than he let on. Guilt has weight, even when you're good at hiding it. He was carrying more than I was supposed to notice. We ate and talked about nothing meaningful. His day, a Netflix show we'd both half-watched, a neighbor's renovation that was taking forever. I let the conversation breathe, let him settle into the comfort of a normal evening, let the wine do its soft work. And then, casually, naturally, the way you'd mention any small, unremarkable thing, I said, "I applied for a marketing role this week, actually, just to see what's out there." He looked up from his plate. "Oh yeah? Where?" And I looked right at him, not with accusation, not with drama, just with the clear, steady eyes of a woman who had done her homework, and said, "Nexus Analytics, actually. Thought my background might be a good fit." The silence that followed was maybe 3 seconds long. It felt like a year. Ryan's face did something extraordinary in those 3 seconds. I watched it with the focused attention of someone who had stopped trusting their instincts and then got them back. Because I'd spent weeks relearning how to read what was actually in front of me, not what I'd been trained to see. First came the blink, one too many. Then a very brief, very controlled reorganization of his expression, the kind that happens when a person is running rapid calculations behind their eyes. Then a smile, slightly too wide, slightly too fast. And, "Ha, that's funny timing. I think they just filled that role, actually." He reached for his wine. His hand was steady, but the smile was wrong. "Really?" I said. "I didn't hear back yet. Maybe I should follow up." He shrugged, fork back in hand, eyes on his plate. "I honestly don't know the details. HR handles all of that. I stay out of it." A lie delivered with such practiced ease that if I hadn't already known the truth, I might have believed it. But I did know. And what I was collecting now wasn't information. I already had that. I was collecting behavioral evidence. The way a person behaves when they're cornered, even gently, tells you everything about the architecture of their deception. Ryan was scared. Not panicked. Not yet. But scared. The lie was load-bearing, and somewhere in his body he could feel someone pressing on a wall. I changed the subject smoothly. We finished dinner. I asked about his upcoming travel, and he told me about a conference in Denver next month. with the relaxed fluency of a man who'd had months to rehearse his calendar. I nodded and made a mental note to forward the dates to Rachel, because if he was planning travel while this case was being built, we needed to know. We cleared the dishes together, the way we always had. He kissed me on the cheek before going upstairs. And I stood at the sink, hands in warm water, thinking about the exact email that Rachel and David were preparing, and the precise moment it was set to land. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Clean, earned, undeniable power. The thing about a trap built on truth is that it doesn't require you to do much. You don't have to maneuver or manipulate or deceive in return. You just have to hold the space, stay calm, and let the lie begin to eat itself. Ryan had built his double life on the assumption that I would never look. He had no contingency for a version of me who had already looked, already found everything, and was already 3 steps ahead. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the dossier was nearly complete. And when it landed, it was going to land everywhere at once. Rachel Morrison, I learned quickly, did not do anything halfway. She had a second monitor on her desk, covered in open tabs, and a legal pad that looked like the output of a military briefing. In the 3 weeks between the dinner and what we came to call the send, she and David Chen had built something I can only describe as devastating. Not in a chaotic way, but in the way a perfectly constructed argument is devastating, where every piece fits so precisely that the whole structure is irrefutable. The dossier contained transaction records, cross-referenced against travel manifests and public social media metadata. It contained HR internal communications where Sophia was referred to in ways that made Ryan's deception organizational, not just personal. It contained statements from 2 junior employees who had been confused by the Mrs. Park situation for years and were willing to go on record. David had also pulled security footage from the building's parking garage, cameras that had been formally requisitioned by the facilities and compliance team months earlier as part of a standard security upgrade, long before any of this came to light. He hadn't installed them for Ryan. He'd simply requested the archived logs once the pattern became undeniable. The footage included 17 separate instances of Ryan and Sophia arriving together at the building in the same vehicle, including 3 occasions where Ryan had told me he was traveling out of state. 17 instances. Rachel reviewed each one, time-stamped and logged. She called it a pattern of deception so consistent it becomes a behavioral fingerprint. I thought about the word fingerprint. The evidence didn't just prove what he did, it proved who he was. And that distinction mattered enormously to me. The decision about where to send the dossier was made with the same precision as its contents. Rachel and I agreed that a direct confrontation with Ryan, even through lawyers, would give him time to prepare, to spin, to lawyer up before the institutional momentum could build. Instead, we targeted the board first. Nexus Analytics had 7 board members. We had personal email addresses for 5 of them, sourced through David's legitimate corporate communications history. The journalists came second. They were the witnesses after the board was already forced to act, receiving the dossier under embargo with a request for comment timed only after the emergency session had been called. They wouldn't publish until the audit was confirmed. The goal was not destruction for its own sake. The goal was accountability. And accountability, to be real, requires witnesses. The email went out on a Tuesday at 6:47 a.m., early enough to land before anyone's workday calendar filled up, late enough that it wouldn't sit overnight and give anyone time to coordinate a response before business hours. Rachel had written the cover note herself, concise, factual, free of emotional language, with the dossier attached as a PDF and a brief summary of the legal proceedings already initiated. I was named as Ryan's legal spouse and the aggrieved party in an ongoing divorce filing. The email did not call Ryan names. It did not editorialize. It presented facts, sourced them, and noted that an independent audit had been formally requested by the CFO. It was the most powerful thing I had ever sent in my life, and my name was on it. I sat in Rachel's office while the emails were dispatched, There was a moment, maybe 30 seconds, where neither of us spoke. Outside the window, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in autumn: gray sky, a few leaves catching on the glass, the muffled sound of the city carrying on. And I thought about the version of me who had driven to that job interview with a polished portfolio and a rehearsed pitch and a tentative, hopeful energy. I thought about the conference room, the HR rep, the frozen silence, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, not yet, but the particular peace of knowing that the truth was no longer mine alone to carry. It was out. It was in the world. And Ryan Park was about to find out exactly what it costs to underestimate a woman with clarity of purpose, 5 years of patience, and a CFO who kept receipts. What happened in the 48 hours that followed was something I couldn't have choreographed if I'd tried. The board didn't circle the wagons around Ryan. The board panicked. The first call came at 8:14 a.m., less than 90 minutes after the emails landed. It was to Rachel from the board's legal counsel, and Rachel said later the tone was notably not defensive. It was damage control from the jump. That told her everything she needed to know. The board hadn't been fully in the dark about irregularities. They'd been choosing not to look. The dossier hadn't created a scandal. It had forced them to stop pretending they hadn't smelled smoke. By noon, 2 board members had independently verified the transaction records with their own financial advisors. By 2 p.m., Ryan had been contacted and informed that the board was convening an emergency session. I know this because David texted me a single word: moving. I was in a coffee shop with my laptop open, and I had to take a long, slow breath. Ryan called me at 2:47 p.m. I watched my phone ring and let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear his voice, not because I was afraid of what I'd feel, but because I knew exactly what he would say, and I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of delivering it directly. He called twice more. Then a text. "We need to talk, please." Then nothing for an hour. I imagined him in a room somewhere, his office maybe, or his car, doing the same rapid recalculation I had watched cross his face over dinner, except now the numbers weren't adding up. The dossier was factual. The board was already moving. The divorce filing was on record. There was no good play left. That moment, the moment a person runs out of moves, is not justice by itself, but it is a necessary precondition for it. He came home that night. I had expected Ryan to arrive in rage. That had always been his register when cornered in smaller ways, a hot, slightly intimidating frustration that had historically been enough to make me back down. But he didn't come in raging. He came in collapsed. That was the word for it. He sat at the kitchen table, and for a moment he just looked at me, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years, and said, "How long have you known?" And I said, "Long enough to do this right." He started with the denials. They were reflexive, half-hearted, the kind of denials that even the person saying them knows are theatrical. Then he moved to minimization, then to bargaining, actual bargaining, which was almost sad in its desperation. I let him go through the stages. I didn't interrupt. I just waited. Sophia had found out through a colleague, someone at the company who'd seen the board communication and, with or without protocol, had forwarded the relevant sections to her. Rachel had anticipated this possibility and had included a paragraph in the dossier that addressed Sophia directly. Neutral in tone, factual, framing her as a third party who had been systematically misled about Ryan's marital status. It was deliberate. It was strategic. And it worked in a way I hadn't fully expected. Sophia resigned the same afternoon. Not in anger, not in scandal, but in the kind of quiet, devastated dignity of someone who realizes they've been played in a game they didn't know they'd entered. She released a single statement to HR. She had been deceived regarding the CEO's personal circumstances and would be stepping down effective immediately. Karma had arrived, and it hadn't come shouting. By the end of that week, the board had suspended Ryan pending the independent audit. The tech press had run the first pieces. Careful, sourced, citing the ongoing divorce proceedings. And Nexus Analytics was, for the first time in its history, in genuine crisis. Ryan had been humiliated by the thing he'd spent years constructing. The double life, the fraud, the carefully managed narratives. All of it was now public, documented, and being reviewed by people with subpoena power. He had shamed himself in every direction at once, and the architecture he'd built to protect himself had become the evidence against him. I watched it from a distance, the way you watch a building you once loved fall, and I felt something complicated that I can only describe as the first exhale after years of holding my breath. The legal proceedings that followed would take months, but the story, the real story, was already written. And for the first time, I was the one holding the pen. Rachel Morrison described our case on the day we filed the formal divorce petition as textbook dissipation of marital assets with a significantly enhanced damages profile. I wrote down the phrase because it sounded so clean and clinical for something that felt so personal. What it meant, in real terms, was this. The nearly $2 million Ryan had siphoned from Nexus Analytics for the condo, the travel, the gifts, the entire infrastructure of his second life, had been funded in part by a company whose growth I had supported through 5 years of unpaid emotional and strategic labor. Rachel argued, compellingly, that my contribution to Nexus Analytics during its early critical years, the brand consulting I had done informally, the networking, the positioning advice that Ryan had freely translated into company strategy, constituted a form of marital contribution to that asset. The company had flourished partly because of me, and I had been cut out of it by a man who had also been stealing from it. The judge, Rachel said, was paying attention. The financial settlement took 6 months of negotiation, 1 near trial, and a moment in a deposition where Ryan's own lawyer looked visibly uncomfortable with the answers being given. What I ultimately secured included a significant cash settlement drawn from Ryan's personal assets, a portion of the Nexus Analytics equity he had vested over the marriage, restitution for the career income I had forgone, calculated using industry salary data and my pre-marriage trajectory, and a clause that Rachel fought hard for, a formal acknowledgement, written into the agreement, that the marital estate had been damaged by Ryan's dissipation. It wasn't just money, it was the record. Somewhere in a legal document, for as long as documents exist, it stated plainly that what he had done was wrong, that it had cost something real, and that it had been corrected. That mattered more than I expected it to. Ryan's legal exposure didn't end with the divorce. The independent audit commissioned by the board found what David had suspected, a systematic pattern of financial misappropriation totaling $194 million over 31 months. The CFO's documentation, combined with the employee testimonies and the access logs Rachel had subpoenaed from Nexus's own servers, made the case almost automatic. Ryan was charged with corporate fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. He took a plea, avoiding prison in exchange for full restitution to the company, forfeiture of his remaining equity, and a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director in regulated corporate environments. He was, in the precise legal and corporate sense of the word, finished. The karma that I had spent years wondering if it would ever arrive had shown up, methodically, in 300-page audit reports. What I want to say about the restitution, the financial piece, is that it was never actually about the money. I know that sounds like something people say, but I mean it in a specific way. The money represented reclamation. It represented the years I had spent deferring my own ambitions in service of a marriage that was being systematically defrauded. Every dollar of that settlement was a kind of translation. This is what your time was worth. This is what your sacrifice cost. This is what you were owed and were denied. It was the material form of the dignity I was reclaiming, the self-worth I was reassembling from the pieces of a life I had almost let someone else permanently define. You cannot put a number on that exactly, but the law can try, and sometimes trying is enough. I also want to say something about the moment I signed the divorce papers. because I think people expect it to feel like relief, or grief, or triumph. And for me, it felt like none of those things exactly. It felt like setting down something very heavy that I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. Rachel handed me the pen, and I signed my name, Ruby Reyes, the name I was born with, the one I quietly decided to return to the moment the filing became official. And then I sat with it for a moment. Outside, it was raining. Rachel brought coffee. We didn't say anything for a while. We didn't have to. The paperwork was done. The record was corrected. And the next chapter, the one that was entirely mine, was already beginning. What I didn't know, sitting in that office with rain on the glass and coffee in my hand, was that the most unexpected part of the story was still ahead of me. That the company at the center of all of it, Nexus Analytics, the place where I had been told I didn't exist, was about to offer me something I never would have imagined walking into that conference room. The call from the Nexus board came 4 months after the divorce was finalized. I almost didn't pick up, because I had been doing extraordinarily well at not looking backward. I was already VP of brand strategy at a consultancy I respected, settled into a new apartment in the West Loop, working with a therapist I was genuinely grateful for, and rebuilding a sense of professional identity that felt nothing like the borrowed kind I'd had in Ryan's shadow. Margaret had told me, during one of our check-ins, that the best revenge on a system that discounted you was to outlast it, outwork it, and outthink it until the system asks you to come fix it. I had thought that was a nice metaphor. I had not expected it to be literal. But the board chair, a woman named Patricia Okafor, was very clear. They needed a turnaround leader with ethical credibility, brand authority, and the kind of cultural instinct that couldn't be hired from a search firm. David had endorsed me. A headhunter had conducted due diligence, and Patricia said the board was unanimous. Let me be honest about what it felt like to walk back into the Nexus Analytics building as its incoming CEO. It felt like the closing of a loop that I had once assumed would break me. This was the building where I had been told, by a kind HR rep named Priya, that I was nobody. This was the building where my husband had constructed a second life, funded a second woman, and built a false reality so convincing that an entire company had believed it. I had been backstabbed in this building. I had felt humiliated and shamed in this building. And now I was walking in through the main entrance with a signed offer letter and a plan that had nothing to do with payback and everything to do with rebuilding something that was worth building. That distinction between revenge and reconstruction had become the operating principle of my entire life. My first 3 months as CEO were focused on 2 things: culture and accountability. I commissioned an independent ethics review, separate from the board audit, specifically focused on how the previous leadership's misconduct had been enabled by structural gaps. Where were the oversight failures? Where had the reporting culture been suppressed? Where had people suspected something and felt unable to speak? The review was not comfortable for anyone, including some people who were still on the team. But discomfort in service of clarity is not cruelty. It's exactly the kind of rigor a company needs when it's been run by someone who depended on ambiguity to sustain his fraud. I implemented a mandatory reporting structure, restructured expense approval so that no single executive had unilateral authority, and brought in an external audit firm on a rotating annual contract. I also, quietly but intentionally, began shifting the company's public identity. Nexus Analytics had been built on Ryan's personal brand, his charisma, his founder mythology, his ability to generate press. That foundation was gone, and in its place I wanted something more durable, a culture of transparency, a genuine commitment to the kind of inclusive leadership that had been conspicuously absent before. I brought in 2 new board members with strong ethics and governance backgrounds. I updated the company's mission language to reflect the actual work being done. And I gave interviews, carefully chosen, strategically timed, that addressed what had happened directly and without theatrics, and explained what the new Nexus stood for. The response from the industry was something I hadn't fully anticipated. Respect. Real, earned, peer-level respect. Because people can tell when someone isn't performing accountability. They can tell when it's real. The most surprising part of the transformation wasn't the strategy. It was the feeling. Every morning I came into that building and sat at a desk that I had earned, not through proximity to someone else's ambition, but through the specific, hard, clear-eyed work of the previous 2 years. I felt something I had almost forgotten was available to me. Self-worth. Not the borrowed kind, not the supportive partner kind, but the kind that lives in your chest and doesn't depend on anyone else's approval or narrative. They didn't hire me because I was the wife. They hired me because I understood the brand, the breach, the culture, and had already proven I could hold the truth without theatrics. I had reclaimed something Ryan had never actually been able to take, because it was never something he'd given me. It had always been mine. But the chapter wasn't quite finished. There was one more decision I needed to make, one that most people in my position would have found unthinkable. And it was the decision that, I think, said the most about who I had become. I had been CEO for 8 months when David Chen brought me Sophia Park's application. It arrived in my inbox the way most applications do, through the proper channels, screened by HR, forwarded with a summary. But David attached a brief, careful note. I thought you should see this personally before it goes further. Your call entirely. I sat with it for a day before I opened the attachment, not because I was afraid of what I'd feel, but because I wanted to be sure that what I felt would be clean, not contaminated by ego or old hurt or the very human desire to be the person in the room with the most power. When I finally opened it, I read it carefully, professionally, the way I would any qualified candidate's application. And she was qualified, genuinely, compellingly qualified. Here is what I had come to understand about Sophia Park in the months since everything unraveled. She had been deceived in essentially the same way I had. Ryan had built his double life on 2 separate lies, deployed to 2 separate women, each designed to eliminate the possibility of the other ever being investigated. I had been told I was too fragile for corporate life. She had been told he was free. We were both instruments in the same fraud, positioned strategically to never compare notes. The betrayal that had been directed at me had also, in its own way, been directed at her. She had lost her career, her relationship, and her sense of reality all in the same week, without having chosen any of the circumstances that had put her there. I was not going to pretend that didn't matter. I called her myself. I know that surprised her. She said so after a silence that lasted long enough to be honest. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about Ryan, not about the past, not about the bracelet or the company party photos or the 37 months of overlapping deception. We talked about the role. We talked about what she would bring to the operations division, what her vision was, how she thought about team accountability. She was sharp and direct and had clearly spent the past 8 months rebuilding something in herself, the way people do when they have no choice but to. By the end of the call, I had made my decision. I hired her. The reaction from some quarters was predictable. Confused, vaguely scandalized, occasionally framed as weakness. But I want to be very precise about what it actually was. It was not forgiveness of Ryan. It was not amnesia about what had happened. It was a choice, a clear-eyed, strategic, values-driven choice, to not let Ryan's lie determine the relationship between 2 women who had never actually been rivals. He had positioned us as competitors in a story we hadn't written. I was refusing to keep playing it. That isn't weakness. That is the kind of power that doesn't need to dominate in order to be real. It is, I think, what justice actually looks like when it's been done right. Not the absence of consequence, but the presence of something better in its place. Sophia and I don't have a friendship exactly. We have something that might be more interesting. A mutual respect built on shared experience, on the particular clarity of having survived the same architect of chaos, and on a commitment to building something he never could have. She is good at her job. I am good at mine. The company is better for both of us being in it. And Ryan Park? The man who lied to both of us, cheated both of us, stole from a company and called it strategy, is the cautionary tale now. Not us. Not ever again. What I did next was the thing I hadn't planned, the thing you can't plan, which was to sit quietly in my office one afternoon, after the workday had ended and the building had emptied, and simply feel it all. The weight and the distance and the strange, hard-won beauty of where I had ended up. The woman who had walked into this building with a portfolio and a pitch had become its leader. The woman who had been told she didn't exist here had made it her own, and the vengeance I had wanted, the real kind, the kind that lasts, was this. A life that was genuinely mine, and that brought me, finally, to the last thing I needed to say about all of it. There is a version of this story where I spend the rest of my life being defined by what Ryan did to me. I have met women living that version, and I understand it. The wound is real. The betrayal was real. The years were real. When someone uses your trust and your sacrifice to build themselves a better life while lying to your face, the damage doesn't end the day the divorce papers are signed. It lives in the body. It shows up in small moments. When someone says, "I'll handle this," and you feel the old, reflexive instinct to believe them, to defer, to be the anchor again. The work of reclaiming yourself isn't dramatic. It's daily. It's 100 small decisions to stay in your own body, your own perspective, your own unedited version of what you know to be true. What I want to say, the thing I most want the people watching this to hear, is that I didn't destroy my life. Ryan destroyed his. I simply refused to destroy mine too by agreeing to live in the ruins he'd created. That is the distinction that took me the longest to understand. When someone betrays you, they're counting on one of two responses. Either you collapse, or you retaliate messily and give them the chaos they can use to rewrite the narrative. What they are not prepared for is a woman who takes a breath, consults a lawyer, rebuilds her career, and waits until the moment she can deliver justice with documentation and precision. That kind of response doesn't compute for a person who has only ever operated through manipulation. It is, frankly, the most disorienting thing you can do to someone who counted on your weakness. The self-worth piece is the one I return to most. Because here's what I know now that I didn't know in those years of being someone's anchor. Your value is not determined by how much you're willing to subordinate yourself to someone else's vision. It was never determined by that. The dignity I walked into my own marriage with, the person I was before I started organizing Ryan's press appearances and attending his dinners and making myself small so he could feel large, that person didn't go anywhere. She waited. She held on, quietly, in the parts of me that still wrote in journals and updated portfolios, and felt that restless, inarticulate pull toward something more. She was the one who walked into that job interview. She was the one who didn't fall apart in the conference room. She was the one who called Margaret and hired Rachel and set the trap and sent the email. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of this, if you're still in the conference room, still staring at evidence you don't yet know what to do with, still trying to figure out whether what you felt was real or whether you're the problem, I want to tell you something important. You are not the problem. The lies were real. The manipulation was real. The gaslighting was real. And the fact that it was done carefully, over time, with patience and precision, does not make it your fault for not seeing it sooner. You trusted someone you loved. That is not a character flaw. That is the cost of intimacy with the wrong person, and it is theirs to pay, not yours. The karma in this story didn't arrive as an accident. It arrived because people kept records, asked the right questions, and refused to be silent when the evidence demanded action. Justice, real justice, is almost never a single explosive moment. It's cumulative. It's the slow, steady, unglamorous work of documenting the truth and putting it in front of the right people at the right time. It requires patience that sometimes feels impossible. It requires the willingness to be strategic when everything in you wants to be emotional. And it requires, above all, the belief that you are worth the effort. That your story, your years, your sacrifices are worth fighting for. Because they are. You are. Every single time. The woman who walked into Nexus Analytics that morning looking for a job came out the other side as its CEO. Not because the story ended perfectly. Stories never end perfectly. They just keep going in a new direction. But because she refused to accept the story that someone else had written for her. She picked up the pen. She rewrote it. And if there's one thing I hope you take from everything I've told you, it's this. The pen has always been in your hands. Pick it up. So here's where I leave you, not with an ending, because honestly, the story is still going. I still walk into that building every morning. I still sit at that desk. And sometimes, just for a moment, I think about the woman who almost didn't walk back in. Almost convinced herself she didn't belong. Almost believed the story someone else had written about her. I think about how close I came to staying small. And then I think about everything that came after. The dossier, the audit, the settlement, the offer letter, the hiring call with Sophia, the work. And I am genuinely grateful for every hard, disorienting, clarifying moment of it. But I want to know about you. Because if you made it to the end of this, something in this story landed. Maybe it was the gaslighting. Maybe it was the quiet sacrifice that wasn't honored. Maybe it was the specific, nauseating recognition of being told you were too fragile to participate in your own life. Or maybe it was the part about picking up the pen. Whatever it was, I want to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been in a situation where someone rewrote reality around you, and what did it take for you to see through it? Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely? Family, partner, colleague? And what did justice actually look like for you when it came? Or maybe you're in the middle of it right now and you're trying to figure out your next move. Tell me. This space is for exactly that conversation. And if this story made you think, if it provoked something, challenged something, or made you feel a little less alone in something you've been carrying, then please do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this channel exists for exactly this kind of story. The ones that go deeper than surface drama. The ones about identity, reclamation, the specific courage it takes to stop living in someone else's ruins and build something real. Every week we go back in. We sit with the hard, complicated, inconvenient truth of what it actually looks like to reclaim your dignity when someone has tried to take it. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Trust me on that.